Hi, everybody, and welcome to this week's edition of Straight Talk with Bren O'Brien and Tim Rowe from the Straight, where we're dealing with all things breeding, racing, and wagering today. Going through in that order to talk about the big issues that are going on across the racing world. Tim, it's been a lot going on at the end of the year. We don't get too many quiet times in this space, and so there's plenty of news to sort of reflect upon this week. The first one I wanted to kick off on and sort of talk about. I wrote a story earlier this week about the way that Zoo Star's been travelling, and for the second year in a row, he'll be the most prolific winner getter on the planet, which is quite significant for an Australian side to be able to do that. Obviously, helped by the fact he was reverse shuttling. And what I find really interesting is probably 5 to 10 years ago, we had a lot of Australian stallions headed overseas in order to work both hemispheres, and they benefit significantly in terms of having good horses on both sides of the equator. We're just not seeing that anymore. And like I think next year, it looks like from my research that there's only one horse, which is Star Spangled Banner, who'll travel from Australia to overseas as an Australian bred horse and shuttle. I mean, you're well connected in this space. You understand sort of the economics of the way this works. I mean, is this just a partial trend? Is it a long-term trend? What's your perspective on it?
Well, I'd say possibly a longer term trend. To be honest, there's only really probably two major players that have stallions as a rule, on en masse, capable of shuttling or would be willing to take that risk, which is obviously Godolphin and Coolmore. And as I touched on, risk is a big part of it. Horses aren't cars. Things can go wrong. It's not a welfare issue, but looking after them. If you do get a good stallion, which is very hard to do, I think maybe 6 in 100 stallions that go to start actually properly make it and become supersized, so to speak, or the top five. So, those studs outside, the Coolmores and the Godolphins that don't quite have the scale, it is an added risk, which is already a risky game by sending stallions over overseas to reverse shuttle. Obviously, since Exceed and Excel and Fastnet Rock and stallions of that ilk that did really well in the Northern Hemisphere stopped going over, that's coincided with the Australian racing industry, I guess, the coffers going up or the prize money sales prices skyrocketing. So there's a lot of value just keeping the horses here. Or, a stallion that you thought may have been suited to shuttling. I'm Invincible, the son of Invincible Spirit. That's Yarraman's best stallion they have had and ever will have. Why would they take that risk of shuttling him over there? Yes, it might be more profitable in the short term, but, he's so good over here, just looking after him, giving him the winter off before he gets stuck into the breeding season again. And, even we've seen with Zoo Star, as you touched on, he went for, was it 4 or 5 years and done a great job, but giving him, part of the reason that he didn't go back would be looking after him. He's getting a bit older, everyone's possibly a future champion Australian sire.
Yeah, what's interesting about that, if you look at what with Zoostar, the challenge they've got there is obviously he was a bit of a rarity because not many of these horses tend to shuttle after they're already established in Australia. So he was already pretty much proven in Australia before he started shuttling to Twin Hills. So therefore, he's getting these terrific results now. I think if you look at his numbers, I think it's like I think it's 286. I think he's got at the moment winners in 2024. About 220 of those I believe are Southern Hemisphere born and 60 are Northern Hemisphere born. The challenge he's got is that he stands for $250,000, whatever he does over here, and over there he stands for a lot less. And so your ability to eke a return out of that makes it more difficult. Star Spangled Banner is a fascinating case, Tim. Like if you look at him across, and he sits relatively highly in these global rankings because he's been able to shuttle to both hemispheres. But when you have well documented that he had significant fertility issues early in his stud career, which he's been able to overcome. But he's a fascinating case of a horse that has, and probably one of the few, I would say, that have had more success in the Northern Hemisphere than they have in the Southern Hemisphere. And he continues to have success. He's had a tremendously successful 2024. Even as a stallion who is getting on a bit in years now, his record over there is quite amazing, to a point where at least I think there was 1 year where he stayed in the Northern Hemisphere and didn't come back south.
Yep.
Is that right, Tim? Yeah.
That's
So
correct.
I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, it's interesting in that regard. I guess my point coming back to it, and if you look at the fact that where Australian styles sit and our dominant size and these sprint size that have dominated Australia over the years, if we have the best sprinters in the world, which we generally think we do, and probably most of the world tends to think the same way. Um, you know, why aren't they attractive enough to make it work over there? Is it a America's got a lot of stallions, so it's harder over there. I get that, and shuttling to America has been very few stallions that have been able to go over there from Australia and make. I think Monroe was over there for a bit. Horse like I think Stern was over there, wasn't he, Tim? There's a few
Yeah,
others
and
that
Vancouver's throwing stakes winners over there,
yeah
in the States as well. But again, I think it's recognition. We, as people that are interested in or cover, and punters on Saturdays know the Australian horses. The large percentage of the population, racing fans and owners and stuff, won't know the champions of Europe and America.
yeah
So when they come down, there is that education process that the stallion farms has to go through marketing and and Too Darn Hot,
yeah
very, very good stallion, obviously, and top racehorse, but even so, took some time to market to certain breeders. Obviously, those that tapped into him have done extremely well right from the get go, and unfortunately, probably maybe he won't come back, but. He's served 58 mares Southern Hemisphere time this year, and I'm sure that those numbers will at least stay at that level ongoing.
It's interesting too. You look at the fact I think Too Darn Hot and Justify back to back first season champion size in Australia, and I think Justify was the first one since More Than Ready in 2005 to an internationally bred stallion to shuttle stallion effectively to have been a first season sire in Australia, which sort of puts an interesting dynamic on that. But I guess the other point being is, I guess you're talking about fast horses shuttling either side. Toronado is probably regarded as probably one of the fastest sons of High Chaparral. His profile was quite from that line was quite sprint orientated, and he's had tremendous success. I think he's fifth on the list overall of stallions with what he was going to do. Now he hasn't shuttled to France for a little while because he's so dominant in Australia. But I find it interesting that there's not more of that sort of going back and forth. And if you look at the performances of Australian size, the fact that if Zoustar was to get to 300 winners this year, he'd be up amongst Danehill and More Than Ready, who are stallions that have been able to get above 300 in a year globally. Now that's a very rare air for any stallion to be in, let alone a horse from Australia. So I think it's interesting point. The other point I wanted to quickly move on to in the bloodstock space, Tim, is something that you covered off early in the week. Is look, it's a bit of a nuance, but it's an interesting one from my perspective. It's around about this endoscopic gradings decision and the decision by the sales companies to change the way that they do things. You and I work in this industry. Things don't change readily in this industry, do they? People don't change for the sake of change. So I think it's quite monumental that they've decided to go with a different system to assess, I guess, the throat problems and stuff of horses and how they assess how significant they are and whether they'll impact their racing ability.
Well, to highlight your point, the Lane Fallon grading system that the Australian Australasian companies have been using and vets was formally established in 1993, and the one they've moved to, the Havermeyer system, was established in 2003. So it's taken 20 plus years to adopt that, although the Northern Hemisphere has long been using the Havermeyer system. Now, X-rays and scopes obviously play a vital role in the selling of a yearling or its value and who's prepared to take risks. A lot of people are prepared to overlook X-rays, particularly except for those traders who are obviously on trading to Hong Kong or got gold wishes to do that. They have to pay a lot of attention to those X-rays and can Lofty Strike, I think, was one who was potentially $1 million yearling and his X-rays didn't stack up, so the Colt syndicates were off and he was passed in, and Paul Lapidus was able to buy him for $280,000 and been a good buy. Peter Moody, I think, and Kieran Maher and people like that, probably going back a bit, didn't pay any attention to X-rays. I think they have to now with the amount of money they're spending and looking after their clients and so forth. But scope's a completely different thing. If you can't breathe, you can't run. You see your horses under pressure, that if they can't breathe properly, they just stop effectively. So scopes play a vital role, and where the controversy has been, or the frustration from vendors and breeders, I guess, is it's that under the old system, the grade threes, there was three, A, B and C within that. Grade 3 goes from 1 to 5. If you're in grade 4 and 5, all sorts of trouble. Vendors probably wouldn't even take them to sale. 1 and 2, you find it was that grade 3, and the science showed that if you're A and B, you're still effectively almost 1 and 2. There was little difference in racetrack performance. But again, this industry thrives on perception, and so trying to change certain buyers' habits of going, no, if it's grade 3, they just don't want to look at it, particularly, again, if those traders going on to Hong Kong or whatever. There was that frustrated vendors going, there's nothing wrong with this horse, but the vet's penned it. So they've come up with a better system. Certainly this is post-sale at the moment. So all yearling buyers have the option to get their horse yearling scoped, and if it fails a scope, the sale's voided. So that's where it's at the moment. But I guess the important thing is, will buyers, owners, trainers, bloodstock agents with their vets start using the Havermeyer system for pre-sale vet checks, which, as Dr. Chris Lawler told me, you'd be mad to ignore the science, and so hopefully the buyers will start using this Havermeyer system where, to put it, as I touched on, the grade 3 under the old system, 20% of yearlings would fall into that range. Now it'll be, but only 4 or 5% will fall into that range where they're likely to suffer breathing issues, and it's a greater risk for the buyer. So it's a more accurate way of, I guess, assessing the potential risks of breathing issues ongoing as 2 and 3 year olds particularly.
Just a quick one, Tim. I mean, just for my benefit, sort of in terms of pre and post sale, is the pre-sale endoscopy stuff just not done because they don't want 50 inspectors putting it, doing their own scopes, or is it a case that there'd be a pre-sale scope that would be able to be
the visions? I could be corrected here, but when the yearlings arrive on complex, they go for a scope, and say Magic Millions, Dr. Kim Rose and his assistant Emma would undertake that. Or the vision would be taken, and all.
And we're looking at the lining, the way the throat's structured, yeah?
That's right.
And basically the anatomy of the throat, yeah?
Yes, eventually, which is video of it. Yep, and so the vets can assess that, and they can all, and that, again, under the old system, or, you could look at the same vision and 3 vets could all come up with a different grading, where under the new system, they think that's more in line, more accurate. People will be, more consistent, I guess, in their gradings. And that, again, that was part of the frustration, is going, well, my vet said it's a grade 3A or a grade 2, and these 2 vets from wherever acting for X, Y, and Z said, no, it's grade 3B, and where the Havermeyer system's more accurate. So, yes, effectively, it doesn't happen that often, but where a sale is voided, there should be fewer of those, I guess, because it is. I've seen it happen to certain breeders. It's absolutely devastating. You get a good result, or you sell the horse, pour in all the money, the capital, the years of mating plans and whatever, and then at the last minute, the post-sale scope fails and it's all voided.
Yeah, interesting. All right, move on to the racing world now, and an interesting little story this week, Tim, that you covered off was the shutting down of Marcus Oldham's equine business course. Now, I guess it's a smallish problem, but it's a Victorian course that has had effectively an equine business course for a long period of time. There's significant graduates that come through there. With a lot of people have come through and developed their skills, horse trainers, bloodstock agents. Really important for getting an understanding of the industry, but also creating connections. I guess, Tim, what I wanted to ask you about is, what do you think this says about the broader challenges about the racing industry, the breeding industry, attracting people to to come through training programs into the industry and get an understanding? Does it put up a bit of a red light for you about where racing should sit, where this problem is for racing and how it should be addressed?
Yes, I guess in a way that people trainers or blood stock, some of those people you mentioned, Henry Dwyer, Cliff Brown, Jeremy Rogers, who did work for Darren Weir, and obviously Archie Alexander. There's loads of them. The course has been going for more than 40 years. So I guess it shows that, racing, you've got to do the hard yards. It can be a low-paying job to work your way up, even if you are, I guess, tertiary educated. And so there's other pathways, obviously on-the-job practical skills if you want to be a trainer working in a stable. I guess where courses like this were important was the business skills that you would learn. And as Jeremy Rogers told me, the connections that he was able to make through Marcus Oldham and the opportunities to go and work overseas, which are still there outside Marcus Oldham or tertiary education, but it was just a formal way of doing things, and I guess it's a sign of the times. There are industry bodies trying to address that, like Thoroughbred Breeders Australia with their tertiary educated courses.
Graduate program and stuff.
Graduate program, that they're implementing, and there's others out there. But I guess, agriculture and, comes down to, I guess, what people can earn as well. As Marcus Oldham people told me, is, people could still do the agribusiness courses or the other agri, and then move into equine afterwards if they wanted to by doing practical stuff, or, at wherever, insurance companies or stables or so forth. But, it is disappointing, but you can't. But it just wasn't viable. They used to get 40 and 50 students a year. Now that I think there's 15 next year about. So, just the costs involved in running a course like that, it's just not viable, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's an ongoing challenge for the broader industry, though, to have a education pathway for people to come into it and have formal qualifications attached around that. And that's probably the challenge that it's got to be addressed in a few different ways. It is addressed to a certain extent, but racing's divided landscape, whether it be state by state or whether it be the industries we work in between racing and breeding, wagering, stuff that we talk about all the time. It does seem like it's difficult to actually get a whole of industry solution for this stuff, which is somewhat of a challenge as well. We'll move on now to the Rosehill report, Tim, and I'm happy to have a chat about this in a minute, but I'll flick it over to you. I guess you haven't covered it probably as closely as I have. I don't think too many people have covered it as closely as I have. But from an outside perspective, and from where sort of as you saw it last week when that Rosehill report lobbed, what did you make of it? What did you make of the overall context of it? Some people suggest it was a bit of a wet lettuce that didn't really live up to what they thought it may be. If you understand the scope of the way the parliamentary system works, then you probably know where it lands. But I'm interested in what you thought about it as, I guess, an educated outsider to this discussion, as opposed to someone who spent a lot of their time buried under select committee hearings as I have this year.
Look, I did watch a lot of those hearing days. Maybe that says more about me than you that did it anyway. I tried to be, I was objective in the way I watched it or observed it, I guess, and some of the stories I did write about it. I don't think the committee, certainly publicly, was able to land a killer blow, for want of a better word, for those that wanted to. It was clearly, as Peter V'landys said, it was used as a personal attacks a lot of the time on him and his race in New South Wales under parliamentary privilege. While there was a lot of great theatre, I don't think they landed a blow on Peter V'landys particularly, or Christopher Mintz. Maybe they will with the potential referral to ICAC. But from the public information that we were able to digest, maybe not a wet lettuce. It was, there's certainly possibly some wounds there, but nothing that would force, I don't think, Peter V'landys that would have to, or the board would make Peter resign overnight. And, as we've seen, that hasn't happened yet. But
no, I
stand corrected on that.
Yeah, I don't think that's probably going to happen. There's an article up on the Straight at the moment which sort of sets out, which I've written about, what it actually means to race in New South Wales. Obviously, there's implications for the ATC and the government, which is significant. But obviously, race in New South Wales became central to this. Now, some people have said, why were race in New South Wales sort of so central to this? Did the inquiry stray? And no doubt there were aspects of the inquiry itself admitted, the committee itself admitted, were outside its remit because of the, I guess, the volume of interest and submissions from people from across the board about the function of the New South Wales racing industry. Look, from my perspective, Racing New South Wales needed to be a significant part of this inquiry based upon their involvement through the process. The fact that Peter V'landys and Russell Balding knew about this on November 1, they spoke to their board. They knew more about it than the ATC board did. Now, they were informed by the two key men at the ATC, Peter McGorran, Steve McMahon, about what was going on November 1, and they obviously went to government, discussed that. So all that stuff deserved exploration, as did the fact that Racing New South Wales have been heavily involved in finding the alternate track, which would be what they require, because they require a replacement track for Rosehill to be sold. So, Racing New South Wales were part of this inquiry. No problem with, from my perspective. I think that it was well within the remit. A lot of the stuff that was raised, probably, and the committee itself admitted, sat outside its remit because they were so significant. And if you read what I've written today, there were a couple of concerns raised about the use of whistleblowers, the function of Racing New South Wales. The two recommendations that were probably key to this. The first one is that the Legislative Council looks into conducting a further inquiry into Racing New South Wales. That'd probably look relatively similar to what we've already seen, but it'd be far more focused on what goes on there. So if we get another 6 months of this, it's hard to see that there won't be some sort of ramifications of that. They wouldn't necessarily need the government to support that. They could possibly get it passed through Parliament with the Liberals opposition, and LNP opposition and the crossbench would probably have enough to get up another sort of committee-style hearing into the way things are working out. Now, it comes down to probably whether the opposition have got an appetite to basically involve themselves in a public singing match with Racing New South Wales, and V'landys in particular, across the next 6 months. So that's probably the question around that. The second recommendation is significant enough, is about a review of the Racing Act, or the Thoroughbred Racing Act, which was set up in 1996, under which Racing New South Wales operates. Yeah, that's probably much more likely to get up, because I think even from a government point of view, it's much more politically palatable. It becomes about fixing the system, not becoming pointedly about Racing New South Wales. I think that will happen. I think there will be a review of the Act. Now, whether that takes a quick fast, let's change the Act, or whether that takes let's throw it back into the parliamentary abyss and it'll come out in 2 years' time, maybe more the latter than the former. But I think that's probably likely some action will come around about that. We'll find out when the Minns government comes back to us on March 6th with their formal reply to this. And I guess the point being, this committee was bipartisan. The three Labor members of the committee have put forward their dissenting views in the report. You can read their dissenting views, but they did not specifically dissent to any of the recommendations around Racing New South Wales. And in fact, Bob Nanvo, who's probably been the lead on this from a Labor point of view, was one of the people that approved and put forward the amendment, that they were very concerned about comments made by whistleblowers about potential behaviour by Racing New South Wales. So I think there's a bit more to play out in this. People think this is going to go away. I don't think it will. But I also think that it'll probably find a way through the parliamentary process to sort of work this out. Anyway, it'd be fascinating to see what happens. There's plenty more to cover off. I think it's important to cover. I don't think this is personal. I think this is about, I think there's other, what do I say? There's a degree of personality between Mark Latham and Peter V'landys and what's going on at Racing New South Wales. No doubt about that. But I think that some of the points raised in the inquiry are definitely worth exploring more around about the power and function of Racing New South Wales and the way things have been set up. And I think that they will probably see that in some way or form. All right, Tim, we'll move on from Rosehill because we've covered enough of that. Quickly on to wagering now. It's interesting week. There's a couple of little stories that come out this week, which I'll be interested to seek your feedback on. The first one is, so humble Bendigo harness meeting, right? And TAB are no longer operating. In terms of, no longer on course, have operators servicing those meetings anymore. Part of their new deal, they're not part of the joint venture anymore, so therefore they don't need to provide staff for these things. So you've got a lot of old school people going to the trots, and they can't have a cash bet like they used to. There's probably a bookie there that may not be. Now, Star Sports have stepped up, which is quite interesting. Obviously, they're trying to make an impression, and so there's a marketing opportunity for them. But they've effectively started offering a range of products, including tote derivative products, two cash punters at the track. I reckon it's a really fascinating development about what we may see develop over time, Tim, and whether there is a model for, yeah, it's bizarre we live in a world where your punting experience on track is infinitely worse than it is sitting on your couch. And if you're not going to get people back to any form of the races, no matter what code you are, if it's a worse experience. So if you can't have a cash bet or you can't have a bet that you want to do, yeah, the old-fashioned thing of bookies up in a stand and tab operators over there, that appears to have disappeared. And I think what we may see is possibly some innovation in this space.
Yeah, I think it's for Star Sports particularly, it's a cheap way of garnering goodwill, I guess, and maybe some other smaller corporates will see an opportunity in that. They can't compete, as Shane Curlio said in Warwick's story, that they can't compete with the big 2 or 3 and 4 corporates on marketing dollars. So get into the track, and even if there is only 25 punters there, but they'll be engaged, and they'll recognise Star Sports. Maybe they will open an account and start betting not just at Bendigo on a Wednesday, but throughout the week using Star Sports. Maybe they can start taking exotic bets, the quaddies and things like that as well. It's a good. Why not? I think it's a potential way of the smaller bookies, even sole traders, I guess, the traditional on-course bookies, to start operating.
Do you think it would force Tab back to thinking about putting operators back on course, Tim? If they were losing some market share.
I don't. Look, at this stage, I don't think Gil McLaughlin's going to be losing any sleep over the bookies at
Bendigo Trots.
being a Bendigo Trots, but and they will. Racing Victoria and on the thoroughbred code, obviously footing the bill for Tab staff to be at, I think it's 140 meetings for the rest of the year, and Tab will be at the Melbourne Cup Carnival's major sponsor for starters, so they'll be at the Spring Carnival and things like that. So at this stage, I don't think Tab would care too much. Anecdotally, I was at a pub recently on a Sunday afternoon, as I tend to do sometimes, and real old school Tab punters are there. They said if they get rid of these EBTs, I'm no longer punting. They don't bet on their phones, and these guys are 60, 70, 80. I guess that's that market share legacy that Tabcorp still carries. So there is a service they have to provide it. The retail business, I guess.
Yeah, and I guess just put some context around that. Cash betting at those EBT terminals was effectively, because the way that supervision works, and there was examples of underage people accessing cash betting facilities through that that model has changed a little bit anyway. So that's probably a little bit of a change as well. I'll quickly flick over to New Zealand, Tim, and a story to come out of there over the weekend was that actually it was like literally a day or two before they announced that they were going to ban greyhound racing. We won't get into that story specifically, but that the government have now introduced a bill to effectively geo-block other outside overseas bookmakers, including the Australian bookmakers, from operating within New Zealand, giving Entain/Tab NZ a monopoly. Now that, when it comes into power, or comes into being as a law, will trigger $100 million payment for NZ Tab to then pass out onto the industry and pass through. That's a significant little cash flow. They've already had some significant value flow into New Zealand racing anyway. I just, from that perspective, Tim, do you see, I mean, you were over in New Zealand recently. The mood's obviously changed significantly since Entain have come on board. There's still some challenges that Entain need to work through and NZTR need to work through. But has the nature of the change of their wagering environment sort of reinvigorated sort of where New Zealand racing's at, do you feel?
Slowly it is. I think slowly, there is a bit of optimism. I guess you see it. I'm been working on a breeding story, and you talk to a lot of different people, and they're slowly hoping that this money coming through will first trigger domestic owners and trainers to buy more horses or spend a bit more on the horses they do buy, and then flow on to breeding, I guess. But it's a slow process, and it's the same with punters. I guess geo-blocking New Zealand, probably, well, they're always going to take the money, weren't they? There's absolutely, that was always going to happen, I would have thought. But will it affect that many New Zealand punters? I'm not sure. I assume most already for probably using
I
NZ
think it was about
tab.
$180 million they think goes overseas, which is not
Okay.
an insignificant amount of money.
Yeah, okay.
And the knock-on effect will be that there'll be greater contributions back to New Zealand racing from that anyway. So, if you concentrated on one provider, then it makes that. I do get concerns when monopolies are in place, but in that situation, it's no different to Australia, because Australia doesn't allow overseas providers either. It's just that we've got 150 bookies and they've got one. So that's probably the fundamental difference about whether that's how that works longer term. But no, it's an interesting story, and I kind of feel like the momentum of New Zealand racing, it does seem to be closing their gap somewhat on Australian racing. The gap is still significant, don't get me wrong, but in terms of prize money, in terms of investment, in terms of people's willingness to sell horses or retain horses or whatever else, you've got to think probably in the next 2 or 3 years, we're probably going to see a change in that, aren't we, Tim?
Yeah, I just want to ask you, Bren, that
Mm.
with that geo-blocking legislation coming through, or will be coming through, it did come, as you touched on, 2 days before the government announced they're going to shut greyhound racing. You spoke to Entain. I got a statement from Entain. They must have had a heads up, because potentially shutting part of their product potentially devalues their deal with NZ Tab.
Yeah, I think I would think from that perspective, it'd be interesting to see. A lot of people didn't know anything about this. Some did. Entain haven't indicated whether they got a heads up or not about it, but you would think that they would be a key stakeholder in this discussion. The turnover on New Zealand greyhound racing is nowhere near, what it probably is in Australia in terms of its importance of product. So maybe it's a less important product. I don't know specifically the value of it to the Entain market, but I would think that there would be a little bit of there certainly would. Look, I would think that when Entain signed that deal 18 months ago, there must have been some way that they had to, they would get some visibility or possibly some compensation or something around how this would work, because it does affect their ability to offer products. So, look, it's a fascinating little story and little subplot that these two stories came out within 2 days of one another in the order that they did. Whether we read something into that or not, I'm not too sure. But from my perspective, I think it does show you that when you have a lot of change in an organisation, or a lot of change in an industry, things tend to happen at once. And I just wonder longer term what that means. And we can talk another time about what that might mean for the greyhound racing in Australia, industry in Australia. But I think it's it's an interesting point, and I think Entain would have Entain have got a few things they really want to achieve. They're really laser focused on what they want to achieve in New Zealand, and this is probably part of it. So I think the greyhound stuff will be. Yeah, it would have. There must be some adjustment there to go on, because it's not nothing, Tim. I guess that's my point. It's not like you're getting rid of something that's not doing anything. It is product. It is turnover. They may be able to they may be able to sort of the Australian greyhound racing or whatever else to broadcast that. I'm not too sure. Anyway, it's an interesting point, and as I said, this is a what's the word I'm looking for? It's a dynamic industry. Things change a lot, don't they? So anyway, thanks for joining us on Straight Talk. That's enough of us for this week. Don't forget to give us a rating wherever you're listening to our podcast, and sort of subscribe, whether it be on Apple, Spotify, Podbean, or on YouTube as well. So plenty of places where you can catch up with all the latest from Straight Talk. Go through our episodes, have a listen through. Hopefully we'll have a guest next week to come on board and talk to us about sort of hopefully the bloodstock sales in overseas. It'd be interesting to hear from a member of the bloodstock community about how things went over there. But we'll see you next week, and thanks for listening.